Grant stood in the middle of the community pavilion, sunlight catching the gray now threading through his hair, and told me that leaving me was the smartest decision he had ever made. He said it with a smile, like he expected me to still be standing in the wreckage he left behind 5 years ago, waiting for his approval. Then a small voice shouted, "Daddy!" and Grant's smile came apart in real time, because the little girl running past him wasn't running toward him at all. But to understand that moment, you have to go back to the beginning, to the year everything I thought I knew about my marriage turned out to be a story I had told myself. I met Grant Ellis when I was 29, waiting tables at a steakhouse in Charlotte while I finished my accounting certification at night. He was funny in those days, the kind of funny that made a room feel warmer, and he had a way of looking at me like I was the only interesting thing in it. We married 2 years later in my mother's backyard, under a string of lights he'd hung himself, badly, so that half of them drooped into the hydrangeas. I remember thinking that crooked string of lights was the most romantic thing I'd ever seen, because he'd done it for me. Ruby was born when I was 35. Grant held her in the hospital room and cried, actually cried, and told the nurse she had his mother's chin. For a while, I believed we were the kind of family that survived things. I believed it the way you believe the sun will come up, without evidence, just because it always had. The cracks started small enough that I told myself they weren't cracks at all. Grant had been promoted to regional sales director the year Ruby turned 2, and the promotion came with longer hours, work dinners that ran late, and a new colleague named Sloane Whitmore who kept coming up in conversation with a frequency I noticed but didn't examine too closely. Sloane closed the Meridian account. Sloane had strong opinions about the new CRM system. Sloane thought Grant's presentation needed more data and less charm, which made him laugh in a way he used to laugh about things I said. Looking back, I can point to the exact evening the marriage tipped from strained into something else. It was a Thursday, and Grant came home smelling faintly of a perfume that wasn't mine, and when I asked about it, almost as a joke, he said someone had hugged him goodbye at the office happy hour. I let it go. That was the pattern those months. Small, plausible explanations, each one reasonable enough on its own, and me too tired and too afraid to add them together into a sum I didn't want to see. I told myself it was nothing, because admitting it might be something felt like pulling a thread that would unravel everything I'd built. I was tired in those days, in a way I hadn't known a person could be tired. Ruby wasn't sleeping through the night. I was doing the books for 2 small businesses on the side to help cover the mortgage, since Grant's commissions had gotten unpredictable even as his title got bigger. I told myself the distance between us was just a season, the way new parents talk themselves through the hard years, promising each other that it gets easier once the kids are older, once the schedule settles, once. It didn't get easier. It got quieter, which felt worse. By the time Ruby turned 3, Grant was staying late, 3, sometimes 4 nights a week. He'd stopped asking about my day. He'd stopped noticing when I cut my hair, or when Ruby learned to say his name clearly for the first time, a small triumphant "da-da" that he missed because he was at a dinner with the team. I found myself rehearsing conversations in the shower, ones where I asked him plainly what was happening to us, and then losing my nerve every time he walked through the door, because some cowardly, hopeful part of me was afraid of the answer. The answer found me anyway, on a Tuesday in October, when I was folding Ruby's laundry and his phone buzzed on the kitchen counter with a text preview I wasn't trying to read. It was from a name saved simply as S. It said something about a hotel in Winston-Salem and a conference that, as far as I knew, wasn't happening that weekend. I stood there with one of Ruby's tiny socks in my hand, and I felt the floor tilt under a marriage I had spent 4 years insisting was fine. I didn't confront him that night. I want to say that was strategy, that I was gathering myself, but the truth is simpler than that. I was scared. I was 38 years old with a 3-year-old asleep down the hall, and some old, ugly voice in my head was already telling me that whatever I found, I wouldn't be enough to fix it. I confronted him 2 weeks later, after I'd found enough, a hotel receipt he hadn't bothered to hide well, credit card charges at a jewelry store I'd never seen a gift from, a pattern too consistent to be coincidence. I laid it all out on our kitchen table, the same table where he'd proposed with a ring he couldn't really afford, and I asked him to just tell me the truth, because I could survive the truth. What I couldn't survive was one more month of pretending I didn't already know. Grant didn't deny it. That was almost worse than if he had. He sat down across from me, rubbed his face with both hands, and told me about Sloane, like he was reporting a business decision instead of confessing to an affair. He said she made him feel like himself again. He said things with me had felt like maintenance for a long time, like keeping a house running instead of living in one. I remember staring at him, waiting for the part where he apologized, where he said he'd end it, where he begged for a chance to fix what he'd broken. That part never came. What came instead was the sentence I have never fully been able to forget, even 5 years later, even now, when I no longer need it to hurt. He told me that I should be realistic about my situation, that I was almost 40, exhausted, with a toddler and a mortgage and a job that barely covered the bills, and that no man in his right mind would want to take that on. He said it gently, like he was doing me a kindness by preparing me for a life he'd already decided I deserved. He said Sloane didn't have any of that weighing her down. He said it like weight was something I had chosen to carry, instead of something he had helped put on my back and then walked away from. I didn't cry in front of him. I want that on record, because for a long time I thought my strength in that moment was the only thing that got me through the months after. I sat very still, and I asked him to leave the house that night, and when he tried to argue that it was his house too, I told him he could argue about the house with a lawyer, because I was done arguing about anything with him at that kitchen table. He moved out within the week. He moved in with Sloane within the month, which told me everything about how long the affair had actually been going on, and how little those 2 weeks of, "I need time to think," had ever meant. For the first few months, Grant tried to maintain the shape of fatherhood without the substance of it. He took Ruby every other weekend, mostly to restaurants where he could hand her a tablet and talk to Sloane on the phone in the parking lot. He missed her 3rd birthday party because of a client emergency, and sent a stuffed elephant 2 days late with a card that Sloane had clearly picked out, because Grant had never once in 4 years bought Ruby anything without asking me first what she liked. I watched him fade from her life in increments so small I almost couldn't track them, the way you can't watch a bruise change color but you notice one day it's gone from purple to yellow-green. Every other weekend became once a month. Once a month became, "I'll call this week, I promise." The calls stopped coming. Ruby, who was too young to understand any of it in words, started understanding it in the only language toddlers really have, which is absence. She stopped asking where Daddy was. That silence frightened me more than any tantrum ever could have. 6 months after he left, Grant's lawyer sent papers I hadn't asked for and didn't expect. He wanted to voluntarily terminate his parental rights. He and Sloane were planning a future, the letter explained in careful legal language, and he wanted, quote, "a clean and uncomplicated new beginning." I sat at that same kitchen table, reading a document that reduced my daughter to an obstacle in someone else's clean beginning, and I felt something in me go cold and clear in a way it hadn't been since the night he told me no one would want me. I didn't sign anything that night. I called my own lawyer the next morning, not to fight the loss of him, because by then I understood that Ruby losing an absent father who resented her existence wasn't really a loss at all. I called my lawyer to make sure that whatever happened, whatever came next, Ruby would never for 1 second grow up believing she had been the reason a man walked away. That was mine to carry, not hers. That night, after Ruby was asleep, I sat alone at the kitchen table with the termination papers in front of me and a box of old photographs I hadn't touched since he left. I found a picture from our wedding, the crooked lights glowing behind us, and I looked at the woman in that picture for a long time. She had no idea what was coming. I wasn't angry at her, I just didn't recognize her anymore. I made a decision that night that had nothing to do with Grant and everything to do with the two of us left standing in the house he'd walked out of. I decided that whatever came next, I wasn't going to build it waiting to be chosen by someone. I was going to build a life good enough that Ruby would never once wonder if she'd been born into the wrong one. What I didn't know yet, sitting there with cold coffee and a stack of legal papers, was that 3 states over, in a small mountain town called Asheville, a man I hadn't met was closing up his workshop for the night, unaware that in less than a year, a soft-spoken widower with sawdust on his hands was going to walk into my daughter's life and simply never leave it. I had no way of knowing that yet. All I knew, that October night, was that I was done waiting for a man to decide I was worth staying for. I signed a lease on a smaller house in a town where nobody knew my name as Grant's wife, packed up my daughter's crib and her stuffed elephant, and 4 years of a life that had quietly stopped being mine, and I drove west, toward a place I had visited exactly once, for a cousin's wedding, with no plan beyond the simple, stubborn fact that I refused to raise my daughter in the house where a man had told me I was already used up. I remember pulling onto the interstate just after sunrise, Ruby asleep in her car seat with the stuffed elephant tucked under her chin, the last of the moving boxes rattling faintly in the trunk with every mile marker. I didn't know a single soul in Asheville. I didn't have a job lined up, only a few interviews I'd scheduled from a diner parking lot with spotty cell service. I only knew that the woman driving that car was not the woman Grant had left at the kitchen table, and that whoever I became on the other side of those mountains, she was going to be someone Ruby could be proud of. I had no idea, yet, how much that decision was about to cost me, or how completely it would end up saving us both. Asheville in November was colder than I expected, all gray fog sitting low over the mountains in the mornings, and the little rental house I'd found off a listing photo turned out to have a leaking bathroom faucet, a window that wouldn't quite close, and radiators that clanked like something was trying to get out of the walls. I remember standing in the kitchen my first week, Ruby on my hip, doing math in my head that never came out right no matter how many times I ran it. Daycare cost more than I'd budgeted. My new job doing bookkeeping for a chain of local restaurants paid less than I'd made in Charlotte. Grant's child support, when it came at all, came late and short, and I learned quickly that chasing it cost more in energy than it was worth. I want to be honest about that first year, because I think people hear single mother rebuilding her life and picture something cleaner than it actually was. There was a night I sat on the bathroom floor after Ruby was finally asleep, doing the math on a bill I couldn't cover, and let myself cry the way I hadn't let myself cry in front of Grant. Not delicate crying, the ugly kind, the kind that comes from somewhere old. I let myself have exactly 20 minutes of it, because that was all I could afford, and then I washed my face and went to bed, because Ruby would wake up at 6 either way, and she deserved a mother who was standing up. I want to be clear that I didn't do any of it gracefully. I yelled at Ruby once over spilled juice in a way that had nothing to do with juice and everything to do with exhaustion, and then cried harder than she did afterward, apologizing to a 3-year-old who had already forgotten why I was upset. I learned to stretch a rotisserie chicken across 3 dinners. I learned which grocery store marked down its bread at 7 in the evening. I learned that the version of myself Grant had described at that kitchen table, used up, unwanted, past the point of being worth staying for, was a story he'd told to make his leaving easier, not a fact about who I actually was. I made a few friends that year almost by accident, the way you do when you're too tired to be strategic about anything, including friendship. There was Deb, a single mother of 2 boys who lived 3 streets over, and became the person I called at 10 at night when I couldn't remember if I'd already given Ruby her allergy medicine. There was my boss, Priya, who ran the bookkeeping for the restaurant group and who quietly moved my hours around more than once without ever making it feel like charity. I didn't tell either of them the whole story of what had happened with Grant for a long time. It felt too much like handing someone a bruise and asking them to hold it carefully. But slowly, in pieces, over coffee and carpool lines, I let people in, and I was surprised each time by how little judgment I actually received, and how much of the shame I'd been carrying had been mine alone to put down. I met Caleb Brooks in March, at a Saturday cleanup event for a community garden 2 blocks from my new house. The kind of thing I only went to because a coworker dragged me along, and because Ruby, newly 4, was going through a phase of wanting to be outside every waking hour. Caleb was running the volunteer group building raised beds out of reclaimed lumber, a quiet, broad-shouldered man in his 40s with sawdust in the creases of his hands and a way of giving instructions without ever raising his voice. I noticed him the way you notice competence, which is different from the way you notice charm. Grant had always had charm. Watching Caleb measure a board twice before he cut it once, I realized how long it had been since I'd been around a man who did that. He didn't approach me that first day. That was the thing about Caleb I came to understand slowly. He never approached anyone like he was owed their attention. Ruby was the one who approached him, actually, marching over in her rubber boots to inform him with great seriousness that he was building the fence wrong, because at home our old fence had gone up and down instead of side to side. He crouched to her eye level, considered this with total sincerity, and asked her to show him what she meant. He let a 4-year-old redesign 4 feet of garden fencing with him, nodding along like she was a contractor he respected, and something in my chest loosened watching it. Some old, cold knot I hadn't realized was still tied. I learned later that Caleb had lost his wife, Elena, 3 years before I met him, to an aggressive cancer that took 11 months from diagnosis to funeral. He didn't tell me that story for months, and when he finally did, it wasn't a confession designed to win sympathy. It came out sideways, in a conversation about Ruby's stubbornness, when he mentioned that Elena had been stubborn too, in the same easy way you'd mention any ordinary fact about a person you loved. He wasn't performing grief for me. He was just a man who had survived something and kept working with his hands because the work was honest and didn't ask him to explain himself. For the first few months, we were nothing more than 2 people whose paths crossed at the same community events. He fixed the fence at the little free library on my street. He helped an elderly neighbor of mine, Mrs. O, replace a rotted porch step without ever mentioning it to anyone, which I only found out about because she told me herself, practically glowing with gratitude. I started noticing him the way you notice a pattern before you're willing to name it. He showed up. He didn't need credit for showing up. Those seemed like small things until I considered how rare they actually were. Caleb wasn't perfect, and I want to be honest about that too, because it would be easy to describe him as some kind of quiet saint, and that isn't who he was. He could go stubbornly silent when something upset him instead of saying so, a habit I later learned came from years of a marriage where Elena had done most of the emotional talking for both of them. He kept his workshop meticulously ordered and got visibly tense if someone left a tool out of place, a tension he was self-aware enough to laugh at, but real all the same. He wasn't looking to be anyone's rescue plan, and he told me so plainly, early on, in a conversation I appreciated more than I let on at the time. He said he'd loved being married, and he wasn't interested in doing it halfway again, with anyone, which struck me as either a warning or a promise, and I couldn't yet tell which. Grant, meanwhile, was becoming a rumor in Ruby's life rather than a father in it. He came for his courts-ordered visit in April and canceled the one in May over text. A single line, "Something's come up, we'll reschedule," that he never followed through on. Ruby had started asking about him less and less, which some days felt like relief, and other days felt like a wound I couldn't show anyone. I heard through a mutual friend that he and Sloane had moved to a high-rise in Charlotte, that his promotion had come through, that they'd started talking about a wedding. I felt strangely little about any of it. What I felt instead, most days, was the particular loneliness of being solely responsible for another human being's entire emotional world. Caleb started coming around more directly that summer, not as anyone's boyfriend, just as a man who apparently had decided my daughter and I were people worth being reliable for. He noticed my back porch railing was loose and fixed it on a Tuesday afternoon while Ruby supervised from a lawn chair, handing him the wrong tools with total confidence and him accepting every one of them like it was exactly what he needed. He never asked for anything in return. When I tried to pay him for materials once, he looked almost offended, like I'd misunderstood something basic about what he was doing. I want to say I fell for him quickly, but that wouldn't be honest. I was wary, in a way that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with the version of myself Grant had left behind, the one who'd believed a crooked string of lights meant forever. I watched Caleb the way you watch weather that looks like it might turn, waiting for the moment his consistency cracked into something else, something more familiar, something that would eventually cost me. It never came. He kept showing up in the same steady, unremarkable way, week after week, and eventually I had to admit that the waiting itself was its own kind of exhausting, and that maybe the braver thing was to stop bracing. It was Ruby who made the leap before I did, the way children often do, because they haven't yet learned to be afraid of hope. It happened on an ordinary Thursday in August. Nothing dramatic, no fanfare. Ruby had come down with a stomach bug, the miserable kind that keeps a 4-year-old up half the night, and I'd had to reschedule a client meeting I couldn't really afford to miss. Caleb had stopped by that morning to drop off a bookshelf he'd built for her room, unprompted, unannounced, just a man who'd noticed she liked to keep her books in a pile on the floor and decided that shouldn't be the case anymore. He found us in the middle of her worst hour, Ruby crying and feverish on the couch, me half out of my mind trying to keep her comfortable while mentally rearranging a workday that was already falling apart around me. He didn't ask if he could help. He just set the bookshelf down in the hallway, went to my kitchen, and started making the flat ginger ale my grandmother used to swear by for stomach bugs, which he somehow knew to do without being told, because he asked the right quiet questions instead of offering the wrong loud comfort. He sat on the floor beside the couch, not touching her, just present, and told her in a low, unhurried voice about a dog he'd had as a kid that used to get carsick on every single trip to the lake. Ruby, miserable as she was, laughed once, a small wet hiccup of a laugh, and reached out and took his hand like it was something she'd done 100 times before. I stood in the kitchen doorway and watched my daughter fall asleep, holding the hand of a man who had absolutely no obligation to be in that room, and I felt something shift permanently in my chest, some final piece of the old fear settling into stillness. Later that night, once her fever had broken and I'd finally gotten her down for real, I walked Caleb to his truck, both of us quiet in that easy way that had become normal between us. At the door he turned back and, almost like an afterthought, said he was glad he'd come by. I told him I was glad too, and meant it more than the sentence sounded like it deserved. He didn't try to kiss me. He didn't say anything that turned the moment into more than it needed to be. He just nodded, got in his truck, and drove off into the dark, leaving me standing on my porch with a bookshelf in the hallway and a daughter asleep who had, for the first time since Grant left, reached for a man's hand without being told to. I didn't know yet what Caleb Brooks would become to us. I only knew, standing there in the porch light, that for the first time in almost 2 years, I wasn't bracing for someone to leave, and that the not bracing scared me almost as much as the loneliness had belief. The next 3 years didn't move in a straight line so much as they accumulated, the way a house fills up with a life once people actually start living in it. I could tell you about all of it, but some moments matter more than others, and if I close my eyes, I can still walk through the ones that mattered most. There was the Tuesday, about 8 months after the ginger ale night, when Caleb asked if he could take Ruby and me to dinner. Actually asked, phrasing it carefully, making it clear he understood the difference between being a friend who happened to be around and being something more. I said yes before I'd fully decided to say yes, which told me something true about how I already felt. We went to a diner that let Ruby order pancakes for dinner, which Grant would have called spoiling her, and which Caleb simply called Tuesday. Somewhere between the pancakes and the coffee, without either of us making a formal announcement of it, we became a couple, quietly, the way most true things happen, instead of the way movies suggest they do. There was the winter Ruby turned 5 and got strep throat twice in 6 weeks, and Caleb rearranged his work schedule both times without being asked, showing up with the specific brand of grape popsicles she liked, because he'd apparently filed that detail away without me ever telling him it mattered. There was the spring he taught her to ride a bike in the church parking lot near his workshop, running alongside her with one hand hovering an inch from the seat, not because he needed credit for the moment, but because he wanted her to actually learn how to balance instead of leaning on him forever. When she finally wobbled off on her own, whooping, he didn't cheer the way I expected. He just stood very still and watched her go, and when I looked at his face, I saw something that looked less like pride and more like relief, like a man who'd been quietly terrified of failing at something he cared about and hadn't yet let himself believe he wouldn't. He never once asked Ruby to call him anything. That mattered to me more than I think he ever understood. He never pushed for Dad or corrected her when she called him Caleb, which she did for almost 2 years, easily and without any confusion, the way children can hold 2 truths at once without needing to resolve them into one. I used to wonder, privately, whether that title would ever come, or whether it needed to. I told myself it didn't matter either way, that what he was doing for her mattered more than what she called him while he did it. I mostly believed that. I think some part of me was still braced, even then, for the version of the story where he eventually asked for more credit than he'd earned, and he simply never did. Grant, during those years, existed mostly as paperwork and rare, jarring reappearances. He sent a birthday card for Ruby's 5th birthday, a full 2 weeks late, with a $50 bill folded inside and no note beyond his signature. He skipped her kindergarten graduation entirely, though I hadn't actually expected him there, which was its own small grief. The moment you stop expecting someone is the moment you admit, fully, what they've already shown you they are. I heard through the grapevine that he and Sloane had married in a courthouse ceremony, small and quick, nothing like the backyard wedding with the crooked lights he and I had once had. I felt, when I heard it, an emotion I hadn't expected. Nothing sharp, just a dull, distant recognition, the way you might feel reading about weather in a city you used to live in. It was Deb, actually, who first told me things were unraveling for Grant and Sloane, having heard it secondhand from someone who still worked at his old firm. Sloane, it turned out, had wanted the version of Grant that didn't come with a child, and had been surprised, apparently, to discover that a man capable of walking away from one family was not, in fact, a man incapable of walking toward disappointing her in different ways. There were rumors of his drinking increasing. There were rumors of a second affair on his side, which struck me as almost darkly funny, in the way tragedy sometimes curdles into irony if you wait long enough. I didn't feel vindicated by any of it. Mostly I felt tired on Ruby's behalf, aware that whatever was happening in Grant's life would eventually, in some form, wash back up onto our shore. It washed up in the form of a letter, 18 months later, requesting supervised visitation. Ruby was 7 by then, and the letter arrived on the same week Caleb finished building her a treehouse in the backyard of the house we'd all 3 moved into together the year before. A modest 2-story place on a quiet street. The first home I'd owned outright. My name and Caleb's both on the deed, a fact that still occasionally caught me off guard with how solid it felt. I read Grant's letter standing at the kitchen counter, while Ruby's laughter carried in from the yard, where Caleb was helping her nail up a rope ladder, and I felt old fear try to climb back into my chest before I firmly, deliberately set it back down. I didn't hide the letter from Caleb. We'd built our relationship, from the very beginning, on the specific promise that we wouldn't hide hard things from each other to protect the other person's comfort. A promise Grant had never once offered me. Caleb read it at the kitchen table that night, quiet for a long moment, and then asked me plainly what I wanted to do. Not what he wanted, not what he thought I should do. What I wanted. It was such a small question, and it undid something in me every time he asked it, because it was a question Grant had stopped asking somewhere around the 3rd year of our marriage, if he'd ever really asked it at all. I told my lawyer I wasn't opposed to Grant having a relationship with Ruby, provided it happened slowly, on her terms, without disruption to the stability she'd finally found. I wasn't interested in punishing Grant by keeping him from his daughter out of spite. I was interested in protecting her from a man who had already proven, once, how easily he could disappear. The court agreed to a modest supervised visit schedule, and Grant, true to the pattern I'd learned to expect from him, showed up for the first one and then canceled the second, citing work. The same excuse he'd used to explain away every birthday and recital for the first 2 years of Ruby's life without him. I stopped expecting anything from Grant somewhere in there. Not out of bitterness, but out of simple accuracy, the way you stop expecting rain from a clear sky. Ruby, for her part, barely remembered him beyond a vague, unbothered awareness that she had a biological father who lived somewhere else and occasionally sent a card. She didn't ask about him much. When she did, my answers were honest but careful. That he loved her in the ways he was able to, that not everyone's ability to love matches the size of their responsibility to it, that none of it was because of anything she'd done wrong. She absorbed those answers the way children absorb most hard truths, matter-of-factly, and then went back outside to play. Caleb, for his part, never once used those years to build himself up by tearing Grant down. He never said a cruel word about him in front of Ruby, not even when she was too young to repeat it back, because he believed, he told me once, that a child shouldn't have to carry her father's failures as a story someone else told about him. He let Grant's absence speak for itself, patiently, consistently, over years, trusting that Ruby would eventually understand the shape of it without needing him to draw the outline. I found that harder to manage myself, some days, when the old anger flared up unexpectedly, and it was usually Caleb who talked me down from saying something sharp I'd regret. Not out of protecting Grant, but out of protecting the version of Ruby's childhood we were trying to build. By the time Ruby turned 8, Caleb had become, in every way that actually mattered, her father. He was the one at every school event, sitting in the 3rd row with his phone camera ready, cheering loudest and most off-key during the winter concert. He was the one who taught her to change a bike tire and helped with her math homework at the kitchen table every night, patient in a way I sometimes envied. He was the one she called from a friend's sleepover at 11 at night when she couldn't sleep because of a bad dream. Not me, him, because somewhere in those 5 years, without either of us ever announcing it out loud, he had become the person whose voice made her feel safe enough to fall back asleep. It was Ruby, once again, who made it official before either of us did, on an ordinary evening at the dinner table, when she asked, entirely without ceremony, whether it would be okay if she called him Dad from now on, because that was what he already was to her, and it felt strange, she said, to keep calling him something else. Caleb didn't say anything for a moment. I watched him set down his fork very carefully, the way you set down something you're afraid of dropping, and then he told her, in a voice that came out rougher than usual, that he would be honored. That was the word he used. Honored. I had to excuse myself to the kitchen for a moment, ostensibly for more water, actually because I couldn't trust my own face just then. We were still settling into that new, quietly enormous shift. Ruby calling him Dad as easily as she'd once called him Caleb, like the word had simply been waiting for her to reach for it. When the town's annual Founders' Day celebration rolled around that September, the biggest community event of the year, the one where half of Asheville seemed to turn out for the parade, and the food trucks, and the evening concert in the park. Caleb's restoration business had donated the lumber for the new pavilion the town had built that spring, and the mayor had asked him, with obvious pride, to be part of the ribbon cutting. We arrived early, the three of us, Ruby in a yellow sundress she'd picked out herself, practically vibrating with the particular joy of a child let loose in a crowd full of face painting and funnel cake stands. I remember the exact quality of the afternoon light, gold and heavy the way it gets in the mountains in early fall, and I remember feeling, for one unguarded moment, something close to pure happiness, the kind I hadn't let myself feel without flinching in a very long time. I was scanning the crowd for Ruby, who had run ahead toward the face painting booth, when I saw a face I hadn't seen in almost 2 years, standing near the edge of the pavilion in a shirt too expensive for a small-town festival, watching the crowd with the particular restless energy of a man who'd shown up somewhere he no longer quite belonged. He looked older than I remembered, the confidence I used to mistake for charm gone a little threadbare at the edges, like a suit worn one season too long. I felt Caleb's hand find mine without either of us saying anything, steady, the way it always was, and I understood in that instant that whatever was about to happen, I wasn't going to face it the way I once would have, alone, bracing, already assuming the worst about myself. Grant had come back to Asheville, and Ruby, laughing, sunbright, utterly unaware, was running straight toward the pavilion where both of them were about to be standing in the same small stretch of grass for the first time in 5 years. Grant saw us before we reached him, and something in his posture straightened, the old performance sliding back into place, like he'd never stopped rehearsing it. He smiled the smile I used to mistake for warmth, the one I now recognized as something closer to armor, and walked toward us with the easy confidence of a man who believed he was still owed an audience. "Mara," he said, like we were old colleagues running into each other. Not two people whose marriage had ended at a kitchen table, with a sentence I'd carried for 5 years. "You look good. Small world." I introduced him to Caleb with a steadiness that surprised even me, and I watched Grant's eyes do a quick, assessing pass over him, the kind of look I remembered from every negotiation Grant had ever described winning. Caleb shook his hand once, briefly, polite and unbothered, the handshake of a man who had nothing to prove. Grant didn't waste much time on pleasantries. He never had. He told me, unprompted, that he and Sloane had recently separated, said it the way you might mention a minor inconvenience, and then, almost immediately, pivoted into the version of the story he clearly needed to believe about himself. He said business had never been better. He said he'd been thinking, lately, about how everything happens for a reason, how sometimes the hardest decisions turn out to be the right ones. He said, looking directly at me with that old, familiar certainty, that leaving me all those years ago had been the smartest decision he'd ever made, that it had set him free to become the man he was always supposed to be. I felt the old sting of it, distant now, like touching a scar instead of a wound. There was a time that sentence would have knocked the air out of me. "No man will ever want you," I remember him saying, all those years ago, like he was handing down a verdict instead of making a choice. And now it landed like weather from a season I no longer lived in. I opened my mouth to say something, though I hadn't decided yet what, when a small blur of yellow sundress came tearing across the grass behind him, laughing, face freshly painted with a butterfly across one cheek, calling out in a voice bright with pure, uncomplicated joy, "Daddy! Daddy! Look what I got!" Grant turned, his whole face opening with a kind of stunned, hopeful surprise, already reaching down, and Ruby ran straight past him, close enough that her sleeve nearly brushed his arm, and threw herself instead into Caleb's arms, laughing, holding up her painted cheek for him to admire, utterly unaware that she had just answered, without meaning to, the only question that had ever really mattered. I watched Grant's face do something I will never forget. The smile didn't just fade, it came apart in pieces, confusion first, then disbelief, then something rawer underneath both, something that looked, for one unguarded second, like grief, for a version of himself he'd never actually earned. He looked at Caleb lifting Ruby onto his hip, at her arms wrapped easily around his neck, at the butterfly on her cheek that he had missed the painting of, and I watched 5 years of comfortable self-justification collapse under the weight of one small, honest word. "Daddy," Ruby said again, to Caleb, pointing at her cheek. "It's a monarch." The lady said, "It's the kind that flies really far." "It's the best one I've seen all day," Caleb told her, and I heard the small, careful steadiness in his voice, the sound of a man trying very hard not to make this moment about the man standing 3 feet away from him. Grant found his voice eventually, though it came out thinner than before. "Ruby," he said. "Hi, sweetheart." "It's Dad. I'm your father." Ruby looked at him then, really looked, with the frank, unclouded curiosity of an 8-year-old assessing a stranger who'd claimed a title that didn't match anything in her memory. "I know," she said, not unkindly, just factually, the way she might have identified a distant cousin from a photograph. "Mom has pictures of you." And then, because she was 8 and the festival was full of funnel cake and her best friend was waving from the face painting line, she asked if she could go show Zoe her butterfly, and Caleb set her down, and she ran off again, entirely unbothered, leaving 3 adults standing in the wreckage of a moment that had meant everything to 2 of them, and almost nothing, yet, to her. Grant watched her go, and when he turned back to me, the performance was gone. What was left looked smaller and more honest than anything I'd seen from him in years. "She called him Dad," he said, like he was still working out the arithmetic of it. "She has for a while now," I said. I didn't say it to wound him, though I understood it would. I said it because it was simply true, and I was done softening true things to protect Grant from the consequences of choices he'd made with his eyes open. He tried, over the following weeks, to reclaim ground he seemed to believe was still his by right. He showed up unannounced with an expensive bicycle far too advanced for an 8-year-old, the kind of gift that says more about the giver's guilt than the child's needs. He called twice, offering, out of nowhere, a trip to Disney World, a phone, whatever she wants, as if love could be issued retroactively in a large enough denomination. He told my lawyer, and then me directly, that he was her biological father, and that this fact alone entitled him to more time, more say, more claim than he'd earned through 5 years of birthday cards 2 weeks late and canceled visits. I remember one particular phone call, on a Sunday evening, when he pushed harder than usual, his voice climbing into the register he used to use when he wanted a conversation to go a certain way, and it wasn't cooperating. He said he'd missed things, sure, but that didn't erase what he was, biologically, permanently, whether I liked it or not. He said the court would eventually have to recognize that. I told him, evenly, that courts recognize biology all the time, and that biology had never once been the thing in question between us. What was in question was 5 years of Tuesdays. I don't think he had an answer for that, because for the first time in the conversation, he went quiet. I told him, calmly, in a conversation I'd rehearsed in my head more times than I wanted to admit, that biology had gotten him into a delivery room 8 years ago, and that everything after that had been a choice, made freely, over and over, for 5 straight years. I told him that Caleb hadn't taken anything from him. I told him that a father isn't a fact you're born into and then get to cash in whenever it becomes convenient. It's a role you build, brick by brick, showing up on the ordinary Tuesdays nobody's watching, and that Grant had walked away from that construction site the day he decided a clean new beginning, mattered more than the daughter he was leaving behind in the wreckage. Caleb, I told him, hadn't stolen anything. He had simply picked up the tools Grant set down and never came back for. Grant didn't have a response to that. Not really. He tried a few more times over the following months. A card, a call, an awkward, over-formal lunch invitation that Ruby, when I asked her honestly what she wanted, said she'd try, once, to be fair. She went, cautious and polite, and came home unmoved, telling me matter-of-factly that it had been fine, that he'd talked about his job a lot, that she didn't really have anything to say to him. I didn't push her toward forgiveness she didn't feel, and I didn't poison her against a relationship she might someday want on her own terms. That balance was the hardest part of all of it, harder than the anger had ever been, letting Ruby's own feelings, and not mine, chart the shape of whatever relationship, if any, she chose to build with him. Caleb and I talked about that balance more than almost anything else during those months. He admitted to me once, late at night, that some part of him had wanted to fight harder against Grant's attempts to reinsert himself, not out of jealousy exactly, but out of a fierce, almost frightening protectiveness he hadn't expected to feel this strongly for a child that wasn't biologically his. I told him that was exactly why I trusted him with the decision to hold back, because he wanted to fight for her and chose restraint anyway, for her sake, which was a different thing entirely than not caring enough to fight at all. The following spring, Caleb formally adopted Ruby, a process we started only after she asked us to, in her own words, at the kitchen table, the same table where she'd once asked to call him Dad. She wanted her last name to match his, she said, because it already felt like it should. We sat her down first and explained what adoption actually meant, in language a 9-year-old could hold on to, that it wasn't about erasing where she came from, but about making official, in the eyes of the law, what had already been true in our house for years. She listened carefully, the way she listened to everything important, and then asked if it would hurt, which made Caleb laugh so hard he had to leave the room for a second, and made me realize how much simpler this all was through her eyes than it had ever been through mine. The court date fell on an ordinary Wednesday morning, no crowd, no fanfare, just a small courtroom, a kind-faced judge who smiled the whole way through, and a 9-year-old in her favorite dress, swinging her legs in the tall chair, radiant with the particular joy of watching a truth finally get written down on paper. Afterward, on the courthouse steps, Ruby held both our hands and asked if we could get pancakes for lunch, because it seemed, she said, like the kind of day that needed pancakes. Caleb laughed, the sound of it easy and full, and told her it was exactly that kind of day. I think about that string of crooked lights sometimes, the ones Grant hung so badly the summer we married, and I no longer feel the ache I used to feel remembering them. They weren't proof of love. They were just lights, hung by a man who was, at the time, willing to try. What I have now is different, quieter, harder one. A man who has spent 5 years proving, in 100 small, unglamorous ways, that love was never about the grand gesture or the biological claim. It was always about who stayed, on the ordinary days, when nobody was keeping score but a little girl who was watching anyway, and learning, slowly, what it actually looks like to be chosen. Grant reached out one last time that summer, a short, uncharacteristically humble email, saying he understood now what he hadn't understood then, that he hoped Ruby would let him earn something smaller and slower someday, on her terms, whenever she was ready. I didn't answer for him. That wasn't mine to answer anymore. I forwarded it to Ruby's own email account, the one we'd set up for her school assignments, and told her it would be there whenever, if ever, she wanted to read it. She hasn't mentioned it since, and I haven't asked. Some doors don't need to be closed to stay quiet. They just need to be hers. These days, our house is loud in the particular way I used to be afraid I'd never have again. Ruby's music through the ceiling, Caleb saw humming in the garage on Saturday mornings. The three of us crowded around the same kitchen table, where I once sat alone with legal papers and cold coffee, now covered instead in homework and paint samples for a bedroom Ruby wants repainted for the 4th time this year. I don't know what Grant sees when he thinks about the family he left behind. I only know what I see, most nights, watching a man who never had to be her father teach her how to check the oil in her bicycle chain, patient and unhurried, exactly the way he's done everything else. If this story moved you, tell me in the comments, give it a like, and subscribe for more stories about love, loss, and the families we choose.